My name is Rabbi Andrea London, Rabbi of Bethlehem at the Free Synagogue in Evanston, Illinois, and co-chair of J Street's Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet. And I'm really delighted to be here today as moderator as we reflect on the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin 25 years after his murder. Today, we're going to be reflecting on the questions about how Israeli society has evolved since Rabin's untimely death. As a prominent warrior turned peacemaker, what legacy has Rabin left behind? How is that legacy shaped by the Israelis continuing to fight for peace and democracy? We're honored that we'll hear introductory remarks today from Yuval Rabin, son of the former prime minister, followed by a conversation with Peace Now Executive Director Shaqued Morag and the National Director for School Programming at the Meorer Center for Informal Education Yuval Hod. I just would like to begin with a couple of my own remarks. I think that for many of us, we are very much shaped by the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. My earliest memories, certainly of the Israeli-Arab conflict, have to do with the '67 war. I was very, very little then, and then in '73. And to see Yitzhak Rabin evolve from being a warrior, and I think in particular, I really remember his leadership during the Second Intifada, when at that time he said that we should meet the force of this street protests with violence. And then he grew to understand that that wasn't the way in which we were going to come to peace. And watching him move from having been the great warrior that helped with the establishment of the state of Israel, saved Israel during the '73 war, and then was there during the Second Intifada, and then realized that we needed to move towards peace, had a profound impact on my own life. And really is when I began to be part of the peace movement, was as a result of the Second Intifada. And I think that many of people in my generation will remember exactly where they were in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed. I was sitting in my apartment in New York as a third-year rabbinic student and sitting on my couch and watching as Arafat and Rabin and Clinton were signing and shaking hands with each other, and just wept openly, and so much hope and so much possibility, and feeling like all of the little activism that I'd done just for a few years had really paid off. Of course, now that we're looking almost 30 years since that time and 25 years since Yitzhak Rabin's death, and know that we are still not there yet. And so we want to reflect today to say, how can we learn from Rabin, who went from being a fighter to being a peacemaker, and how we can take his legacy into the future so that we can finish what he started. We can really see peace between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors. I'm really delighted now to turn the screen over to Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the president of J Street and the visionary behind this really important organization. And he is going to say a few words and then introduce us to Yuval Rabin. Jeremy?
Thanks so much, Andrea. And I share with you this sense that for our generation, remembering where we were at the time of the Oslo signing, remembering sadly where we were when we got the news about the assassination, are two of the most memorable and signature moments of our lifetime. Absolutely. I'm very grateful to all of you who have joined us today to reflect on and to honor the memory of the former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. For me personally, and also for J Street as an organization and a movement, I think there's probably no Israeli leader who has better represented and stood for the mission and the values that we are fighting for as J Street than Prime Minister Rabin. He's been an inspiration for me personally, and I know for many who have devoted their lives to the belief that the long-term peace and security that Jewish people sought through establishing a state of their own in their ancient homeland depends on ending the long-running conflicts that it has with its neighbors. When we, as J Street, lead groups to Israel for educational travel, we always begin our trips with a visit to the Rabin Museum in Ramat Aviv. It's there that we can truly appreciate how fully just how the life of this one man and the life of an entire nation were so deeply bound up for more than half a century. The complexities of that history, and we'll dive into that a bit today, are fully laid out in the museum. The internal struggles within Israel and the external struggles with its neighbors, the existential fight for life and freedom and independence and security that I know my family and the Rabin family and so many families experienced over the decades, the tragic fights within Israeli society and those with the Jewish people's neighbors, whether they're Palestinians within the boundaries of mandatory Palestine or those in neighboring Arab countries. The journey that the Prime Minister went through from warrior to peacemaker that Andrea talked about, and the leadership that he demonstrated remains so inspirational for so many of us in J Street today. I'm very, very sorry that in recent weeks, the legacy, that legacy and the inspiration has been called into question by some who I consider to be friends and allies in other important struggles. Let me be very clear. We have so much to learn from digging into and understanding the complex challenges that confronted Yitzhak Rabin in all of the different roles of his life. And we have so much inspiration to be drawn from his leadership and the choices that he made. Today, we also still have so much work to do that has yet to be completed, that was started by the Prime Minister. I'm particularly honored to have the opportunity today to introduce Yuval Rabin, the Prime Minister's son. We've had a chance over the years, Yuval, to work together. Yuval was a leader in the efforts to create the Rabin Center, the very museum I was talking about, to preserve and continue his father's legacy along with his sister and other members of the family and so many others. He's also been at the forefront of really important efforts, well ahead of Jared Kushner, to think about how the state of Israel could tap into changes in the region where it lives and take advantage of openings in the Arab world over the past 2 decades as an avenue toward a broad and comprehensive peace between Israel and its neighbors. Originally called the Israeli Peace Initiative as a response to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, today the umbrella is called the Israel Regional Initiative. Yuval continues his father's work, as do so many members of the family, seeking to find security and peace for the Jewish people through peace with its neighbors and full acceptance into the region. Yuval, it's a real pleasure to introduce you and to ask you to say a few words.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for remembering my father. 25 years is certainly a major piece of time that has gone, and I appreciate everyone bothering to remember. I do want to politely reject the narrative of warrior turned peacemaker. And I really wish you abandon this narrative, because that is the ground, the fertile ground that the likes of Congresswoman Cortez rejects and withdraws from events remembering my father. And fundamentally, I think there is no, it's not a mutually exclusive theme to fight for peace and to fight for security. In fact, it's complementary efforts. We do not have the luxury to abandon the option to protect ourselves. This is the basic premise of the entire Jewish nation, that the state of Israel. Israel has to rely on its own forces, its own security forces, to maintain its independence, its future, its ability to flourish. And throughout his life, I think my father exemplified this dualism. And I can give on a few examples. As the involvement of IDF in his times in social, in making the so-called melting pot flourish, the allocation of soldiers for the teaching positions where teachers were unavailable, the social responsibility IDF took upon himself. I think he had a major role in making this happen. I will remind you his speech right after the 6 Days War, in recognizing the agonies of war and recognizing the enemy's price, the heavy price the enemy paid. And I think that even the infamous statements that he made during the Second Intifada were first and foremost intended to save lives. Yes, killing people shows on CNN better than using a baton. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And he made those fully knowing the implications. He ordered the soldiers to use the force to save lives. No other reason. And yes, he, I think, pursued peace every single day of his life. He maintained that the use of force is a last resort, even if the last resort is a preemptive attack, it is still kept for the last resort. And when he felt the opportunity is there, he seized it. He seized it not for any other reasons, or let me retract maybe and say this. I think that, and I think this is really the first time that he was really given the opportunity to win an elections. He won it big time. In 92, by today's terms, it was a landslide, 44 seats in the Knesset. And he presented to the Knesset a new vision, which is, I think, the equivalent of a New Deal of the US, the historic New Deal, which meant a decent life for all. And he spoke specifically about every Israeli citizen, not just Jews, not just any other sector. He spoke about the life, the everyday life, the jobs, the welfare, the healthcare, the street and the house that a person lives in. And that was the main reason that he went to capture a geostrategic opportunity that he perceived to offer Israel once in history opportunity to break loose from the stagnation. Just prior to his term, the 80s, it was a lost decade as far as Israel goes. Nothing was done except the billions of shekels that went into the settlements. Israel did nothing. There was not a road built, there was not a job created, the hospitals went into decay, the education system went into decay, and he came to change. And it's what he called the changing in national priorities. And everything that was done in those 3 years that he was allowed to maintain, to stay in office was nothing short of miracle. More than doubling the education budget, more than doubling the healthcare budget, more than doubling the welfare budgets, pouring money into the infrastructure, bringing jobs, opening, and I'm not talking about the peace process. So I really think, and I'm probably extending the time that I have available. So I think that please, let's drop this narrative of warrior turned peacemaker. He was both all along throughout his life. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, in uniform and out of uniform.
Thank you so much, Yuval, for your comments, for your teaching, for your sharing your memories. We really, really appreciate that. That we'll remember that warrior and peacemaker are not opposed to each other, but need to go together, that we need to care about the peace and the security for the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and for the Palestinians. We need to work hand in hand to do that. Thank you so much. May your father's memory always be for a blessing as we remember him today. I would now like to introduce our two panelists today. Shaqued Morag is a seasoned political and social activist, currently serving as Peace Now's executive director. She served previously in senior positions in the Meorer Party, including as the party's interim secretary general after Moshe Raz became a member of Knesset, and as parliamentary advisor to MK Michal Rosen. Prior to this, she served as the community coordinator in Jerusalem for Mapach Tagir, a grassroots Israeli Jewish Palestinian organization for social change, where she is now a member of the executive Committee. And our other speaker today is Yuval Hod. He has been an informal educator for the better part of 2 decades. He grew up in Zichron Yaakov, where he joined the Hanoar Halomed V'Ha'oved movement as a guide and mentor, and went on to be responsible for the activities of the movement in Kiryat Chaim for his national service year, and continued coordinating the movement's activities in the Gezer and Mazkeret Batya after his army service. Since 2014, Yuval has been responsible for informal education in schools throughout Israel with the Merkaz Hadracha HaMeorer, acting as National Director of School Programming since 2016, whose programs meet 25,000 youth yearly. Yuval lives in the Dror, Israel Urban Educators Kibbutz in Sderot. Shaqued, we could start with you. Could you start off by introducing yourself more fully and how you got involved in the work you do as a political and peace activist? And more specifically, could you share how Rabin's life and legacy has influenced you and the work that Peace Now does? Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I wanted to say good evening, but I guess that's only for us here in Israel. For you, it's middle of the day, so good day. I'll start by talking about Rabin's role in my political education, because it was earlier in my life. I actually remember Rabin as my first political recognition involved Rabin. I remember the election of 1992 and the slogan, Israel is waiting for Rabin. And the next thing happened after he was elected is that peace burst into our lives. It was just, as I remember it, it was one peace accord after the other. I'm including here the Oslo Accords and the peace with Jordan. And I remember as a child watching TV and seeing those historical moments made me believe that this is the role of a leader. This is the leadership I knew, I saw. And peace surrounded us in the culture, in the system of education. We had programs that dealt with peace inside the school. We had peace in the song festivals for children. It became a value worth wishing for and believing in, and not just a vague vision, but something that actually happened. I was sure enough to know that our leadership is doing whatever is within its power to reach peace and to end wars, which is for a child a very it's something that troubled me to think about the option of war as someone who grew in Israel and heard the stories, knowing that someone is working in order that those stories will not repeat themselves and we won't experience loss and pain like our parents did, was very reassuring. And it took a while before I realized that Rabin's assassination ended this festival of we all want peace, give peace a chance. Even though we are undergoing terror attacks, we knew that there is an alternative. This alternative is something that unfortunately the current generation is not experiencing as something real that is available to them. I think this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I want to restore that that alternative and that realistic option for future. And I'm doing it in Peace Now because I believe that this is, this is the major peace movement in Israel. This is a symbol I remember from those days and before I was born. And I also want to refer, and then I'll end, to, I talked about my childhood. In my adulthood, when I started my studies in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I moved to Jerusalem, it was the first time that I saw occupation, that I became aware of the fact that occupation exists. Even though I served in the army, in the Air Force, I knew that Palestinians exist, but I didn't see the civil life under occupation until I was in Jerusalem, seeing my neighbors in the other side of Jerusalem, actually having a different set of rights than I did. And my state is responsible for that gap. And this is part of a non-democratic system. And seeing this in the city where I lived and participating in demonstrations against evictions of families from their houses because of Israeli discriminative law, I'm talking about Sheikh Jarrah demonstrations, and also experiencing the success in Sheikh Jarrah demonstrations showed me that there is a lot to be done as civilians in Israel, and that we can really make a change, not only in the political sphere, where I did have served my time as an advisor, but also as a civil society that can be the force ahead of politicians, that draws them in our direction and shows them which values we want them to lead and to put in the top of their priorities. And this is my theory of change that I follow now in Peace Now.
Thank you, Shaqued. I would now like to turn to you, Yuval Hod, and to ask the same question, to let us know how you got involved in the work you're doing in informal education, and how has Rabin's life and legacy impacted your own life, as well as the work of Meorer and the Dror Israel Educators Kibbutz.
Hi, good afternoon for everyone. I was a bit younger than Shaqued. I was a small boy when Rabin was assassinated, and I don't have a lot of memories from my early childhood. I do remember the morning after he was assassinated because I was asleep that evening. And my mom woke me up and she said, "Listen, something horrible happened and you have to be sad. Rabin was assassinated. I didn't know who he was." She was crying. She told me we have to be sad, and this is a huge thing that happened. And I said, okay, I'll be sad if we have to be sad. And I went to school, and I remember all the teachers were crying, and so all the students were crying too. And I didn't really fully understand what was happening and why. And later in my life, and through mostly through the activities in the Noved youth movement, I got to learn or be educated about what happened and why it happened, and how Israeli society got to a situation where someone can assassinate the prime minister, and what parts of Israel were for this assassination, and how violence shapes Israeli society and Israeli democracy in a bad way, and how like one of the things that are most present in my life is fighting for Israeli society and for Israeli democracy, and seeing Rabin's assassination as an edge point where Israeli society was almost ripped at the seams, or got ripped at the seams in some way, and trying to educate myself and all the different people that I meet at my job, to educate them about the importance of Israeli society, democracy, and the importance of this tambo, street sign, trying to say how we can stop things from getting this bad in our society. So that's a very big part of what I do every October and November, and throughout the year, meeting young Israelis and trying to educate them about how democracy is supposed to work.
Do you want to continue, Yuval, and tell us, how do you educate the youth about how democracy is supposed to work and what Rabin's legacy is? What are the messages you're trying to get across? And maybe you want to share some stories about times in which you've been successful at that, and what the challenges are in educating the next generation.
So in education, it's very hard to see results. You plant lots of seeds, and I hope that good trees will come from these seeds. But I think learning about the environment, the political environment, and the social environment in the early 90s, and how people used violence and incitement to object to Rabin's causes. I mean, not just demonstrations or protests, but actual calls for violence, calling for religious violence, calling for violence towards Rabin, towards his government, saying it has no legitimacy, even though, as Yuval Rabin said, won in a landslide election, and trying to use violence inside the political process. So we talk to the youth a lot about that, and about how did we learn our lesson? Is Israeli society in the past 25 years? Do we know how to not use violence? Today in Israeli society, it's very depressing because there is a lot of violence in the street, a lot of political violence towards protesters and towards people trying to say what they want or speak up. And the internet is like a playground for all sorts of violence and violent opinions. And we try to combat that on the micro scale. How do the kids and the young adults, how do they speak to each other? What's the atmosphere in their classroom? What happens inside the classroom affect Israeli democracy at large? And if we have a classroom that different people can speak their mind and have their voices heard, and nobody's violent to one another, then maybe we can have a larger Israeli society that these are the basis of how we conduct ourselves in the political and the public sphere. So I'm in charge of activities for about 20 or 30,000 kids and youth each year. And hopefully in the past 20 years that Meorer is working, we managed to do some good, or some of these seeds grew into strong trees that are fighting for democracy and for a better, more peaceful Israeli society, where different opinions can be heard and not be attacked. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do. And also just to say one last thing, and also educate who was Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered. What were his choices in life and how he fought for a very strong, very sovereign Israel in all his all different places in his life, in the Palmach, in the army, as a politician, and how he strengthened Israeli society and Israeli resilience, and how in the 90s, strengthening Israeli society was being for peace and signing very tough peace deals. And I agree with everything that Yuval Rabin said about being a warrior and a peace fighter, and it not being complementary, not contradicting one another. So that's what we try to tell the kids, or the small children.
Thank you. I was struck, Yuval, when we were preparing for this, how you really talked about Rabin as being a pragmatist, that he really saw what was needed in order for Israeli society to continue to flourish, to continue to be safe, and that he worked from a pragmatic perspective, which is, again, what Yuval Rabin was talking about being both a warrior and a peacemaker. But how do we be practical and what is really needed? And he was able to see that vision of something new, something that peace was needed in order to ensure Israel's security and long-term well-being. And I'd like to turn back to Shaqued. Could you tell us about the work that Peace Now does with Palestinian partners and the opportunities and challenges that
Well, yes, actually, unfortunately, during the last 6 months or maybe a bit more, we weren't available. We weren't able to meet with our Palestinian partners because of COVID-19. It was extremely interesting to chat with them on Zoom, though, and to understand, for example, that for them a lockdown is different than for us because they are more experienced in it, unfortunately. But this is an anecdote that they say that being under a lockdown by their own authority is a different experience than being in a lockdown under occupation. But this is just an anecdote. Usually we try to be in touch with the Palestinian leadership and to maintain Israeli confidence in the and trust. I'm talking about the trust of the people. The government doesn't want to listen, but the trust of the Israeli people in the willingness of the Palestinian leadership to move forward with the two-state solution. When I just entered my position, I was invited to lead a peace delegation to Mahmoud Abbas, where we've heard him stressing his commitment to the two-state solution, including the core issues, quite similarly to the way we see them. I must tell you that for me as a new director in Peace Now, it was extremely important to witness and hear it with my own experience so that I can deliver with confidence this message to the Israeli public. Not many in Israel gets the opportunity to meet Palestinians. We did take some of our activists to visit in Ramallah in several opportunities, and it's a very interesting experience for Israelis, even peace activists, even human rights activists. Don't necessarily go inside Ramallah and experience the modern city with vivid nightlife and shopping areas and a life that can vision that can help us imagine a Palestinian state. This is what happens to us rarely, that we go and see that. What we usually see is what Palestinians usually in Area C experience under the Israeli occupation, where we defend or try to show solidarity with Palestinian families in East Jerusalem that are under danger of eviction from their homes and even during the evictions. And in this case, this is not the modern and positive, optimistic vision that we want to show the Israelis. What we do see there is families that are beat by the Israeli joint forces that take over their private property, but in general perspective also it's aimed at taking over the entire Palestinian claim for East Jerusalem. And it's quite the same. It's most accessible to our activists in East Jerusalem. As I said, me as an activist, my own experience was meeting underprivileged Palestinians in East Jerusalem. But we also fight with the Palestinians in Area C in other places, such as Hebron and Bedouin communities like Khan al-Ahmar and other areas where Israel keeps Israel or Israeli settlers constantly try to take over and dominate the land and kick away the Palestinians from where they live. Recently, we see lots of violence, including olive tree burning and other kinds of vandalism in order to make the Palestinian people who live there miserable and push them away, make it less cutting their hope for a Palestinian state. Apart from the deep empathy that we feel for those people, and for example, we're going to join the Palestinian farmers in their olive tree olive picking in order to assist them and to be there for them if they're attacked by their settler neighbors. And us being there with them is very, I hope, it's a way to build trust, and it's also a way to bring back the message to the Israelis, because most Israelis, I believe, are not like the violent, radical group among the settlers. What we need to do is demand that politicians make it stop this violence and make other ways of taking over land also stop. And what we try to do is to raise awareness and build political pressure in order to change that. And by the way, we get lots of American Jewish support, including, for example, in our front with the JNF, joining forces with Elad, the settler movement that takes over houses in East Jerusalem. And while Israelis still see, most Israelis, I think, still see JNF as a Zionist movement that plants trees and used to buy lands, the American progressive Jewish communities, I think, are becoming more and more aware and active in revealing and condemning the ways in which JNF is involved in taking over Palestinian property outside of Israel's sovereign territory. And I want to thank you for that, for being allies in this front.
Thank you, Shaqued. Yuval, I'd like to turn to you now, to turn back to Israeli civil society. At the time of Rabin's murder, the incitement against Rabin in the streets was harrowing. We are currently witnessing another moment in Israel in which tensions are running high and large swaths of Israelis are protesting in the streets, many experiencing violence, both verbal and physical. What does the current moment in Israel tell us about the strength of Israeli democracy today and how unified or divided Israeli society is at this point?
I think Israeli democracy is very, very fragile. I mean, we saw it many times in the past. It doesn't take a lot to shake Israeli society and shake it a lot. And I think in my ideal vision, every person in Israel goes in protests. I think protests are very, very good for Israeli democracy. I think fear and using violence, and we saw in the last protests in the last couple of months, people being stabbed at protests, people getting tear gassed, not just by cops, but by other citizens. opposing citizens driving by and going and participating in these protests is becoming more and more frightening, not just because of the virus, which is always frightening, but because of political violence. And this is one of the, if Israeli society will collapse, I think it will come from this, not some external threat or a huge war. I think what will destroy Israeli society and Israeli democracy is this infighting and this being so intolerant to different opinions and different views than your own. So I think it's an existential threat to Israeli society, not being able to live together, different people, different opinions, and wishing somewhere deep in your heart that the other person will just disappear. And it doesn't matter if he's Palestinian or ultra-Orthodox Jew or just someone who voted for the other party. I think something that runs deep inside the Israeli hearts is, or some Israeli hearts or in the extremes, wishing that the people will just vanish if they don't share my views. And one of the things that we're fighting the most in our seminars, in our educational meetings, is trying to see the other person and the other opinion as a valid opinion, and the other person as a valid person who we need to live together. And life is more interesting, and democracy is stronger if I can live together with someone who has vastly different opinions than mine. And this is true for peacemaking, and this is true for Israeli society, and this is, I think, one of the biggest lessons from Rabin's assassination. If we won't have a strong society that different people can live together and different views can live together under the same democracy roof, then we won't survive as a state, as a country. And this is one of the things that keep me up at night, thinking about Israeli society. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to educate the most is keeping Israeli society strong through having different values and different people be valid in each other's eyes. And I think it's very, very tough because a lot of the protests are for someone or against someone, or all the people who are different than me are all the same and they're all wrong and they're all horrible. And I think combating that is one of the biggest challenges in Israeli society today. So the protests are one form of it, and I can a various degree of different opinions and different activities that all say people who are not like me cannot exist in our society. And the virus amplifies this, and the terrorism amplifies this in the 90s and also today. And I think living in Israel amplifies it a lot. And we have to try to deal with this and deal with the root causes of racism and of intolerance in Israeli society. And that will make a strong society that can also make peace and also make war and also do everything that the society needs to do. But if we won't have a strong society, we won't be able to change anything about the way we live today.
Thank you. There are a few questions that have come in that I would like to pose to both of you. I also know that that Jeremy Ben-Amin would also like to jump in and speak a little bit here. So Jeremy, if you would like to respond to these questions too, that would be great. The questions are, regarding the anti-government demonstrations. Have there also been opposition to the annexation and occupation in those demonstrations? And another question is it possible to work with the settlers to change their violent attacks on Palestinians? So one is, can we work with the settlers and to change that? I mean, you've been talking about that a lot, Yuval, about creating deeper relationships in society and being able to hear other opinions, and also to understand where the opposition to annexation and the occupation has been as part of the demonstrations. I don't know who would like to take that question.
I'll just say about the settlers that we have activities and we meet schools and students that are across the Green Line, and that they are settlers and they have vast opinions. There are about 500,000 Israeli settlers, and they're not all the same. I mean, they have extremes and people who do horrible things, like Shaqued said, who I oppose deeply. And there's people there who are just living there because it's cheaper or because it's where their parents brought them up. And I think we have, like, there's a vast majority inside the settler community, a vast difference, sorry, inside the settler community. And we need to see also the settler community as part of the communities in Israel and try to strengthen the more moderate, more progressive parts of that society and try to make them part of Israeli society as well, because they're not going anywhere. They're not leaving Israeli society just like any other part of Israeli society. So that's just about the settlers.
I may add something about the settlers. When I see this question is, can the settlers change? I wonder, I have actually, it makes me wonder in two directions. First, the settlements are a violation of the international law, and some settlements are illegal outposts, even according to the Israeli law. When you live a life of breaking the law and doing knowingly actions that are directed at taking over someone else's property or dominate the land, let's not talk about private property, some of the property is debatable, but if the life mission is to take over the land, I don't know if you can educate people to do it in a more polite way. This is what they do. If they don't, if they do or don't use physical violence targeted at other humans, it doesn't mean that their general activity is not violent. So and my colleague Shabtai Bendit, who works with me in Peace now and used to be a settler and did establish illegal outposts, he says that when you are educated to believe that you are above the law and you have the right to decide what's right and wrong, then you dominate your area in whatever mean you choose. So this is a more profound educational question, and most of settlers, like Yuval said, are not violent. They just moved and to live on the other side of the green line, and their life is a normal routine, and very similar to the lives of the people inside the green line. But those who take over land and live in the legal outposts see, as I said, they see themselves as above the law. And the question about the demonstrations, I'll relate to it from another perspective. We're going to demonstrate this Saturday in Zion Square. We are going to mark the 25th anniversary memorial, not anniversary, for Rabin's assassination, remembering that the incitement came to a peak in Zion Square in a right-wing rally led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And this sort of incitement is part of his toolbox along the years, the 25 years ever since. And we are experiencing it now as demonstrators, as protesters. We are experiencing violence targeted at the protesters by bullies who are Netanyahu's followers. We see violence targeted at the system of law, at the system of justice, because Netanyahu is using incitement as a way to dominate the discourse. And I think that part of the demonstration, the protest is targeted as in changing this political culture and healing from this deep bad place that Netanyahu has drawn us into. And I hope that we will succeed in reminding Israelis that what horrible results can incitement cause, such as Rabin's assassination, and hopefully people will rise above their political identity and see that they don't want to believe they don't want to live in such culture and atmosphere.
Jeremy, some questions in terms of, we've been talking about Rabin's legacy, but also the legacy of incitement that led to Rabin's assassination, and to see any of the parallels between what happened in Israel prior to Rabin's assassination and some of the incitement that's being stirred in our own country now. And also just you see that what's going to happen in the peace camp if we can be prophets, depending on who wins in the American election.
Thanks, Andrea. I want to actually take a moment just to reflect back on the last hour as we're about to reach an end. And I know that Yuval Rabin had to leave, and I'm sorry for that. And I also know that he was not thrilled with the framing that many of us have, which is that sometimes when a nation and a people need to move in a new direction towards peace after fighting with their enemies, that it actually is the person who is leading the fighting who is best positioned to lead the peace. And I accept on a personal level that for sure Yitzhak Rabin was a man of peace as well as a man of war at the exact same time. I understand that and I accept that. But I also think that it is vital for those of us who are looking for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for a way out of this. I think we have to acknowledge the vital importance of the messenger to the people about the inherent rightness and the justice of the direction being taken. And when you ask a people to make peace with the folks they've been fighting for a century, you do need to have the people who've been leading that fight reassure the people that in fact the time has come for that. And I think that is the signature importance of what Yitzhak Rabin represented 25 years ago, that it reassured a nation, it reassured a people around the world that after decades and decades of fighting with their neighbors, that in fact the time for tears and bloodshed had ended and the time had come to put this behind us. And that vital contribution is something that we need today in Israeli society. We need it in many societies around the world. And as I reflect on Yitzhak Rabin and his importance and his legacy, the word leadership is at the front of it. And what we lack today is leadership. We've lacked it in Israel for quite some time now, perhaps even a vacuum in those entire 25 years. I'll be honest, to my Palestinian friends, I would say that there's a lack of leadership on the Palestinian side as well. And obviously on the American side, we need a change in leadership. And so we stand at the precipice of a new decade and hopefully a better decade than the past one or the one before. But the key to it will be leadership, and people like Yitzhak Rabin, who come from the center of a nation, the center of a people, and can speak to their needs and their desires and their fears, and can reassure them and lead them forward. And that's what we miss so dearly right now. And I'd love to see that emerge, not only on the Israeli side, but also on the Palestinian side and here in the United States. So that's my closing reflection, Andrea.
Thank you, Jeremy. And before we close, I just want to give Yuval and Shaqued, if you'd like to make a closing remark about what you're still learning from Rabin's legacy. And then I have a few words I'd like to say as we. Shaqued?
Okay, I'll go first. What I'd like to add is that we hear lots of criticism and doubt regarding the Oslo Accords that Rabin signed, and whether it was a success or a failure, and why, and what was the real intention of the leadership. We see that, in fact, the division of the West Bank to territories in A, B, and C did do a great service to the settlement movement, because it sort of allowed, or the way they see it and they interpret it now, I'm sure it was not the case back in the 90s in such a strong way. It's like C is already annexed to Israel, and Palestinians can have their autonomy in A and B, and not demand anything else. But I do believe that Rabin saw the settlements as an obstacle to real peace. And the reason why the freezing the settlements was not a part of, it was not written inside the actual treaty, is because he saw the need to stop building in the settlements as an Israeli interest, and not as a compromise you make and something you give to the Palestinians. He, I believe, did see the settlements as I don't need to believe, I can see from his actions. Peace Now's count shows that during Rabin's time, there was a huge decrease in the numbers of settlements and housing units built in the West Bank, and the few housing units that did that were added in cities very close to the Green Line and Haredic cities that were supposed to stay part of Israel in any future agreement. And I believe that Rabin was about to convince, or he believed he could convince the Israelis that settlements were something that we should try to end, to take back into our sovereign borders. The problem is that once it was not written on the paper, anybody who came after Rabin, and I'm talking about Netanyahu in 96, could interpret it in their way and use the bypass roads that Rabin planned in order to allow the Palestinians have control over their civil lives in A territories. So those infrastructures were actually used as a vehicle by the right-wing leadership to increase the settlement enterprise. I hope that in the near future we will have a leader that will be brave enough, like Rabin was, and will lead us to the next step in expanding Israel's control to places and populations that we're not supposed to control. And not long ago, I listened again to Rabin's speech when he received the Nobel Prize. He talked about the sanctity of life, and he talked about life in itself. Like later on, Netanyahu used this term in order to explain to us Israelis that we have to excuse him for not building enough welfare system and education. I mean, like, we have to pay prices in our quality of life in order to maintain life in itself. While Rabin before him did talk about life in itself as fulfilling the entire spectrum of human rights, including education, culture, welfare, and so on. And this relates very strongly to what Yuval Rabin said at the beginning of the conversation. So I strongly agree, and I really look forward to seeing in the near future, a leader that will lead us to fulfill our spectrum of human rights and the Palestinians' lives as well, in a structure of a two-state solution like Rabin started to lead.
I'll
Man,
try to be
we'll find that
brief in
leader,
my,
both in Israel and here. Yeah,
yeah,
because it's
We're
everywhere.
working on it.
Yeah.
So I think leader is very, very important. Like Shaqued said, I think Israeli society or internal society is much more important, because I think we are so divided today that we can't even celebrate the good things that are happening. There was a peace agreement with Bahrain and with the United Arab Emirates and with Sudan. And I was so excited when it happened. And I said to my friends, let's open a champagne bottle. I mean, we're going to have a deal with Sudan. And they told me, yeah, but it's Bibi and there's our interest and it's very, very bad. And it's good for him, so it's bad for us. And I said, listen, peace with Sudan is better than war with Sudan. And peace with the United Arab Emirates is better than not having peace. And these are good things, and we should celebrate good things. And we should celebrate peace. And everything is very, very polarized and very, very political, that if it's good for Bibi, it has to be bad for us. And I think looking at society, I mean, if we don't overcome these gaps in our society and this polarization and this hating of the other, then we won't be able to have peace, and we won't be able to celebrate peace when we have it. So I think it's the society in Israel has to take a couple of big steps into being more cohesive and being more intertwined and being more loving. Simply loving your neighbor and the other parts of Israel, even if they're different from you, that is the biggest stepping stone towards peace outside of our borders. I mean, having peace inside of our borders. That's something I would like for us to wish every day, and especially today, remembering Rabin's legacy and Rabin's assassination, and what fertile ground the assassinator came from, and this hate. And thank you.
Thank you, Yuval and Shaqued, for your comments, for what you were doing in terms of creating that Israeli society and building that democracy, Yuval, and Shaqued, with working towards peace. And you are the leaders. It's not just, who's going to lead the Knesset, but, the leaders of Israeli society, creating that fertile ground from which those leaders can arise. I'd just like to end with a little short story I have thinking about Rabin's assassination and about his legacy. In the year 2000, shortly after the Second Intifada broke out, the Jewish Federation of North America had their General Assembly meeting in Chicago. And I got invited to come down to lead worship services. And as I walked into the hotel, there was somebody from the Israeli consulate who grabbed me and said, Rabbi London, I'd like you to come and to meet some Israelis that we brought here for this General Assembly. And I went and I sat down, and there was a family whose son had just been taken captive on the Lebanese border. He was serving in Sahel in the IDF, and he had been taken captive along with a few other young men, and nobody knew their fate. Unfortunately, we found out not too long after that they had each been killed. But at the time, we didn't know, and they brought these people in to tell their story and to share their fear and their panic about what's happening in Israel as the Second Intifada was exploding all around them. And I went to sit with this family, and my heart was just breaking. Man, how do you even have a conversation or listen to the pain of someone who doesn't know what's happened to their son? And fears the worst, and unfortunately the worst was to come. And as we concluded our conversation together, he gave me a little present, and I really treasure this, and I'm going to put it up to the screen. I hope that you can see it. It's a dove, and it says on it, Lo nishkach, we will not forget. And then it says the 4th of November 1995, which is the English date, the Gregorian calendar of Rabin's assassination. And I've really treasured this pin, ever since, to think about this family that was facing its most awful loss, a loss loss of a child, said we cannot forget the legacy of Rabin and that peace is essential. And this is what he said to me, and he handed me this pin. And I always wear it every year at this time to remember Rabin and his pragmatism and his desire for peace, because this is what the Israeli society needed in order to have security within its borders and to give dignity and rights also to the Palestinians. May we continue to work towards that peace. May we continue to uphold Rabin's legacy. Thank you, Shaqued and Yuval, for all that you do in Israeli society to make that dream a reality, and know that all of us here at J Street are supportive of the work that you are doing, and we are partners, maybe from afar, but certainly right close to you in terms of what you are trying to create. Toda rabba.
Toda.
And that ends our session. Thank you.
Toda rabba. Thanks a lot.